This week, as I was preparing to speak, I ended up ringing Charlie on Friday, and I just had one question for him. And the question was, how do you personally feel about Australia Day? And we had this conversation that went for nearly an hour, and at the end of it, I thought, I wish we could all have been listening to this conversation. So we're going to replay some of that conversation for you this morning, but I want to put it in context first. And I want to give you a little bit of background behind the story. Now, if you're here for the first time, I love the fact that you're here. Someone was here for the first time this morning and I was talking to them. I said, how did you hear about Redgum? And they gave me the best answer I've ever heard. They said, everyone knows about Redgum. Well, I thought that was a great answer, right? But I want us as a people to grow in our capacity to think, to understand with our mind, to worship with our spirit, because ideas matter. Everything we see around us, there was an idea behind it once, then it becomes a reality. And when Jesus, in the last 40 days on earth, he made two dramatic statements, well, really commands, and both of them are completely ridiculous. And I use that word deliberately. Ridiculous means unreasonable and almost laughable. To say to humans, love one another. And then he sets the bar so high. And he sets himself as an example of that kind of love. Like, friends may be able to do that. Really close friends sort of can get there. But have a look around this room. That's ridiculous. Really. To love one another. And then other New Testament writers, they get on the same little bandwagon. And Peter, he says, above all, this is in 1 Peter 4 verse 8, he says, above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. The word sins there means offences. And I don't know if you've noticed, but a multitude means a lot, right? And it's like, really? Now, the most hardened skeptic that you'll ever come across may laugh at that, may think that that is impossible, that Christians could love one another to that level. But they won't push back against the idea of loving one another. They won't. But the second command that Jesus gives, different story. He says, all authority, this is in Matthew, he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptising them in the name of the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to do all I've commanded to you to, and then he promises to be with us to the end of the age. That's offensive. That's colonisation. And that's offensive to those living in a democracy in 2025, and increasingly so. And right now in Melbourne, there are protests. There have been banners put up stating that the colonies will fall. And there is this angst and offendedness and outrage at what's happened in Australia through colonisation. And to make it worse, Jesus, in the middle of those two commands about loving one another, and Mark makes it even worse because he goes, go into all the world and baptise people, and if they don't respond, they're going to be condemned. That makes it even worse. And so what do we do as Christians in a world that's becoming very upset with the concept of colonising? Like, who are we to tell someone what they believe is wrong? What right do we have to try and convert someone into thinking like us? And so I rang Charlie. I said, Charlie, I actually didn't say this the other day, but this is true, right? Charlie and I are both appearing in a TV program done on Bairnsdale on SBS this year, right? And we did DNA testing as part of this. And this is true. I'm not being stupid, but Charlie and I are Scottish Viking brothers, aren't we? It's true. It is true, right? The only difference is you have this added little genetic background that I don't have. You've got the good looks and you've got the darker skin from a heritage that I don't have. And you have more right to be Australian than I do. And I wanted to ask Charlie, because Charlie has no axe to grind. He has this beautiful Spirit of God upon him. He loves God's grace. And in this world that is being divided over dates and names and stuff, I want us to have a little window into Australia Day. But more than that, I want us to look this morning at the impact on us as God followers about this pushback against colonisation. Because when Jesus taught us to pray, he says, start with God's kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven. That's colonisation. The start of praying is bringing a kingdom from another place to this earth. And God's big plan from the beginning was to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. So, Charlie, I asked you on Friday, what does Australia Day mean to you? And you said that was a big question. Help us understand a little bit through your eyes as an individual. You're not speaking for First Nation people. This is just you as an individual, as a Jesus follower. Give us a little bit of a insight into how you think and feel.
Well, I suppose I look at, and yeah, I only can speak on my own behalf. I never claim to speak on anyone else's. But, growing up and experiencing what I experienced, and then, when you learn, when we first moved to Bairnsdale, and one of the elders, he took me under his wing, Uncle Albert Mullet, and I learnt so much from him that we never learnt in school. And I was just amazed that whenever I just drive or travel, say, from here to Lakes Entrance or something, I never see country the same way again as I used to. You see it in a whole different lens. And, excuse me, it means a lot of things, because learning about, history, Australia's history, and you sort of think, well, why wasn't this taught? We were sort of taught about, Captain Cook and the explorers and that, and it's like there were Aboriginal peoples up till 1788, and then they disappear, from the history books, and learning about, as we're talking about colonisation and the effects of that it's had on peoples around the world, really. But there were also people that came over here that didn't have that same agenda, that coming over by the divine right, you know, to be able to go over and conquer other lands and stuff like that and its people. Because I also think about the Lutherans when they came over from Germany, escaping persecution and coming to South Australia and then making their way up through the interior. And like their founder, I guess Martin Luther, the German reformist, who translated the Bible from Latin into German just so that normal people could read it, because it was only ever in Latin. So those who were educated in that had the control. And so what the Lutherans did going up through, they actually translated the Bible into language, sat down with local groups. And I don't know if anyone's ever seen the Hermannsburg Choir. Fantastic bunch that come from Hermannsburg, up out of Alice Springs, Northern Territory. And I watched a program on them when they actually went back to Germany and took these hymns back and sung to all these churches through Germany in their language. And all these German people were hearing these old hymns in a First Nations language, which was just so incredibly moving, you know. But
I'll just interrupt for a sec, Charlie. But when we were talking on Friday, you were talking about how powerful it was that the Lutherans, instead of trying to get First Nation people to speak English, they were actually taking the Bible into their language. And they weren't trying to wipe out culture and language, because if you look at what's taken place since European settlement, First Nation people have lost language, they've lost culture, they've lost access to land. There's been death through disease and much worse things through what Angus McMillan and others have been part of. And yet God has a plan for this nation beyond all the interactions of humans, good and bad. And I think the pushback against colonisation is what it's the negative part. And in God's kingdom, behind everything God does is for our best. It's love. It's not to take. God's a giver, not a taker. But when we see the Bible through the lens of a democracy, we will misread, we'll be confused, we'll think some things are just wrong. Until you actually see it through the lens of a kingdom. I'll give you an example. When you woke up this morning, no one expected to hear on the news that Australia had taken over New Zealand. I'm just picking a country, right? It seems like a country we should take over and stop them talking like fish and chips, whatever you do, you know. Get them speaking fish and chips, much better. But we do not, in a democracy, expect our borders to increase. But a kingdom, in its purest form, is ever expanding. And in a kingdom, the king says, God says, I the Lord, and declares. But in a democracy, the American Constitution begins with we the people. In a democracy, we design the Constitution, we make up the rules and we make up the laws, and if we don't like them, we will change them. We have a referendum. And so a kingdom operates the opposite to a democracy in so many levels. And unless you see the Bible through the lens of a kingdom, you'll struggle understanding how God approaches everything he does. And so that sense, Charlie, of language to carry God's word, missionaries got a lot of things wrong. You would agree? They got some things right. And I was thinking about in 1830 when a missionary from the London Missionary Society got on a little leaky boat and left England to Samoa to bring the gospel to Samoa. Now, that was seen as noble to go to another people. When Jesus said, go into all the world, make disciples of all nations, they saw that as noble. But now our culture would push back against that, our democracy. And Martin and Jess are such a blessing to us as a church. His mum and dad, Martin's mum and dad, grew up in Samoa. And in Samoa today, Sunday is a national day of rest. In Samoa today, at 6 o'clock every weeknight, the villagers stop for half an hour of prayer. Today. People in Samoa see themselves as Christian. Churches are packed because someone went to another culture. But we get stuff wrong. What do you think some of the missionaries got wrong, Charlie?
There's talking about the kingdom culture and democracy, that one moves through their own self, and the kingdom culture moves through grace. And it's motivated by grace, not to decide to go in and try and change something forcefully, which is a very human thing to do, but just by thinking that we put ourselves here and everyone else isn't. We need to, change that culture, because that culture is wrong. That's not right, And but I think taking, obviously, the missionaries who came over and set up the missions, like obviously Lake Tyers would be our nearest old Church of England mission from once upon a time, and you read stories about how Reverend John Bulmer and others who set up that place. I've read some of his diaries and stuff, and it's all very downward looking on people. It's not trying to lift or encourage people, and so that feeling has obviously gone down through the years, and even when I'm talking to people about God, and they'll go, they came over and did this and that, and well, not all of them, I know there were, absolutely. But I've had some very, very good conversations over the years with different people. But you see, when it comes to the God culture, like I've actually been a real beneficiary of it growing up, because I was adopted into a beautiful, wonderful home, and I reaped those wonderful benefits of being raised in a wonderful home. Obviously, once I left the house, I went out and went around going to school and later on working in that. I copped a lot of the other stuff, going into shops. And I remember Mum was in a shop with me once, and when I wanted to buy a Carlton jersey, and
Wrong football club, that, don't you?
Not at all, not at all.
We won't mention it. Should have been Collingwood.
But going into shops, and then shop owners, I remember once we went into a shop and I was looking, and the shop owner said, "What are you doing in here?" And Mum goes, "What?" And she comes around and she goes, "Excuse me, he's here to buy a jersey. Thank you very much." Anyway, lots of experiences. Yes. But because of the transformation in me, that has allowed that to go out onto others, not in a forceful way, but demonstrating it through love, and that's what speaks to people, And so if every day I'm at work and someone comes in, and like even I'll go to a shop or something gets served, and I try to make it a very special, say thank you so much for that, gee, you do that really well, I just really appreciate, and just always try and leave something with people peddlers of hope.
Peddlers of hope. I love that. Peddlers of hope.
And, so yeah.
Just going back to the thought of how missionaries got stuff wrong and how missionaries got stuff right, it's no different to us. We, the Western Church now, there's a lot of stuff we haven't got right, and we have the opportunity to grow and learn how better to function as God's kings in our communities, God's kids. My sister, she went to Thailand for 11 years as a missionary into a group of people that spoke no English. And as some of those became Christians, they would come to her and they'd say, when they were wanting to get married, we want to have a Christian wedding, with the white dress. And my sister would say, no, you don't. The white dress is a Western culture. You don't need a white dress to have a Christian wedding. Don't confuse Christianity and Western culture. You can get married in a Thai dress, which they did. And we have confused Westernisation and Christianity. And we've looked through the lens of a democracy and not a kingdom. And next week I want to paint a picture of the difference between the two, because it is so different. It is so different. And as I was thinking this week about what I would preach on, which we've put to the side a bit, I was thinking of the command Jesus gave to love one another and the command to go and make disciples. And I realised it's really the same command. Because if you're going to disciple someone, Peter says, above all, love each other deeply. You can't disciple. The moment we think that discipling someone is telling someone what to do, we've got it wrong. When Jesus said, the only way skeptics in our world will believe you are a Jesus follower, that you are who you say you are, and I am who I say I am, the only way is if you love one another. See, the most mature disciple on planet Earth of Jesus is someone who loves others above themselves, that puts someone else's family above our family. There's the humanness that we want to fight for our family above your family, my interests above your interests. But that is not the culture of heaven. That is not how God's kids function with his Spirit in here. Under law, you couldn't do that. So, Charlie, what have you seen the changes in our world, and how do you see First Nation people bringing God's hope into this world that's becoming more divided, like statues being chomped up and sprayed and just this division? How do we combat that?
Yeah. And see, a lot of that stuff that goes on, which, it's just horrible, and people will see that happen, and people who are doing it think they're doing it for the right thing, but they don't represent.
Yes.
Like, they don't represent
They're
me,
offended. They're offended for you, right? And they're doing stuff that you do not want them doing on your behalf.
No.
I know you're as an individual, right? But that outrage, we can't. None of us can go back. In our own families, we can't go back and put the pieces together that have done wrong,
And like with when I read, I read a lot, and
there's a big mob over there, isn't there? All the way back to Steve, back over near the
And
You're reading?
Yeah. What was it?
I can't remember. It's Coral.
So,
people on behalf of, they think they're representing Charlie. Yeah, where to from here, Charlie? Thank you.
Well, there are a lot of, I think that a lot of what we are told and what we're sold through the media is one aspect, but it's not the whole. We never see enough of the good that goes on in this country. You know, we've got some wonderful, you know, Aboriginal men and women who are doing all kinds of things. You know, in my travels, I've met elderly from remote communities and stuff, you know, who have gone through ceremony and then now they're pastors and they're elders and pastors in their own community. So you don't need to choose between one or the other, you know. I was going to I've been... Oh, sorry, Alexa. I've gone
It's okay. You are doing great, Charlie.
There have been a lot of... If I look through history, say if you take, say, the 1967 referendum, for instance, a bunch of men and women from, you know, Aboriginal reserves would travel around the country to drum up interest in and support to change a clause in the Constitution which excluded Aboriginal people from the Australian census. And they wanted to have that taken out. And when they would travel around the country, people like William Cooper, if you don't know it, and Pastor Sir Doug Nichols, and they all come from Cumragunja, where...
The good country, eh?
The good country.
Where do you come from, Charlie?
Cumragunja.
Oh, right, yeah, the good country, yeah. I thought you threw that name in.
That's right.
Charlie's just dropping names. If you don't understand, just drop a few more names up around Barra and Barham and Kundruk and...
Barma. And,
yeah.
In fact, when I go back to Cumra to go and visit uncles and stuff and aunties, first place I go to is the cemetery, because I go to the grave sites of these amazing men and women who, you know, were thrown into jail and fined and beat up and that just so we could be counted in the census, you know. And I get very refreshed and just really encouraged by that. But when they were going around doing all these support, you know, things, wherever they travelled in the country, they were supported by a church. And the church would provide them with accommodation and food. And when they would have their meetings to discuss the next step towards the referendum, bringing the referendum to the Prime Minister, the proposal, they would always start their meetings with a word, Bible readings and hymns. And then they would get down to business. So the church has always been there, you know, for some of these, especially in these earlier times and stuff. And even when I got the job where I am now, my manager, she's born again, you know, and she said to me once when I first started, she said, "Oh, Charlie, you know, God's called you to this place, you know, this is your..." And
you work, just so that those may not know, in the Koori courts?
Yeah, so I work for the Court Services Victoria in the Magistrate Court. I run the Koori Court here at Bairnsdale and in Latrobe Valley. And so, of course, you know, when you work in places like that, you meet people from a lot of different headspaces, I call it, and different places. And so just being able to talk and, you know, I always, when I do my devotions in the morning, I always think, now what can I take to work today, you know? And there's one of my favourite books in the Bible is Proverbs. I love reading Proverbs. And I remember the first time years ago when I first read this Proverbs, says a kind word turns away wrath. And I read that and I just went, I'm going to try that, eh? You know, so I took that to work and, you know, and over the years I've done that, you know, where you walk into a situation where it could potentially go either way, or and you just pretty much just listen, not say a lot, you know, and then but I don't know if that
That is good.
My brain, I tend to wander.
It's fine, Charlie. I appreciate you being here this morning. We'll wind up, but us as a people, as diverse a nation as we are, with all the different ideas and how ideologies change and how once it was noble to go into all the world and speak to nations and share Jesus with them, now we, through the lens of democracy, are pulling back from that. And we, the church, are affected. And yet, fundamentally, love is the only agenda that matters in the way that we are to relate to one another and how we relate to our world. And if we can get that bit right, we'll get the rest of it right. Right now in America, there's an organisation called the Barna Group, and they do research, and it's really reputable, authentic research, and it can be trusted. And 10 years ago in America, 13% of all churches across America felt that they were actually reaching people far from God, 13%. In 2023, that has dropped to 1% of all churches across America believe that they are actually communicating the gospel to unchurched people. 1% of all America. And American is very churchy. 1%. In the same year, 2023, 43%, nearly half of all the Southern Baptists across the Southern Baptist churches in America, 43% of those churches never saw one person come to Jesus or baptised in that whole year. Nearly half of all the Southern Baptist churches. It's because we are pulling back and we don't have a really good theology and understanding of how God's kingdom works and how we communicate that with our world, that has become very anti you trying to tell them they got it wrong. And so we're going to have a little look at that, God's kingdom, how it operates over the next few weeks, and I think it will be very helpful. And I appreciate you, Charlie, because you, as I keep saying, you speak as an individual, but you come from a very unique background. You are part of the stolen generation. You've grown up in a white family. You've shared with me some of the racial prejudice that you've seen and felt. And Charlie and I, we talked on Friday, and Charlie said, just because of who he is, there's a politicalness about him. I said, if I walked into a Melbourne uni, just being white and male, there's a politicalness against me, you know. But we're God's kids. We're Viking Scottish brothers, right? But more than that, we're God's kids, right? Is there anything else you wanted to say, Charlie, before we finish? Anything you wanted to add? Anything you would encourage us as people, how not to get wound up in all the angst that's going on?
Yeah. I guess you can understand where people are coming from, because I'll tell you, like, for me, like, I have a lot of outrage myself, but the way I work it out is different to the way other people might work it out, or how they might respond or react or whatever. So I think it's just asking questions, learning, you know, having a yarn to me sometime if you want. But don't, you know, when you see that sort of thing happen, don't think, well, don't just get upset about it and go, oh, that's terrible, which it is. Absolutely it is. But there's also a measure where we need to try and understand where people are coming from, what's their motivation. And I remember years ago, like with when John Howard was the Prime Minister, and he talked about he didn't want to see a black armband version of Australian history. And you think, so that's, you've just got this side of this part of Australian history. That's way out of balance. We've got to tip the scale back, so you need to learn both. You need to learn it all, and not walk around with oh no, that didn't happen, or no, oh that was so long ago. Who cares? Well, there are families and people who are directly and indirectly affected by that. So there is a lot of trauma, and so we need to understand that too.
And I think understanding history. What I love about First Nation people, you guys actually created emojis, the message stick, right? Message that there was such a network of communication across this country through message sticks, and the emojis that they created, we think they're a modern thing, but they're not. No, been around for a long time. We're going to get the band back up. I love that song. Have you got a song planned? Can we do that, Made for More? Because I think if we can walk away from anything this morning, we are made for more, right? We are made for more. And we have a greater capacity to love through God's Spirit in us than we've ever experienced. We're made for more than just living our life for ourselves. When you really, really love someone and they know it, they will actually want you to speak into their life, because that gives you the opportunity, the right to, because they invite you in. So, yeah. So thank you, Charlie. You're a great man.
Thanks.